The hospital had been abandoned for nearly 3 decades, but the air inside still carried the faint chemical bite of old disinfectants, sharp, sterile, and unsettlingly fresh, as if someone had cleaned the corridors only days ago. Light leaked through cracked windows in thin, dusty beams, illuminating the long stretch of the east wing. Everything here was decayed, collapsed, or reclaimed by mold, except for one thing, the heavy steel door at the very end of the hall. To the staff who once worked here, that door was more than just a barrier. It was a warning. A boundary. A line they refused to cross for reasons that were whispered behind closed office doors and avoided in official reports. Former nurses, long retired, would still clench their jaws when asked about it, their eyes dropping to the floor as if recalling something they had spent years trying to forget. Ward C-21. The name alone was enough to drain color from the faces of those who once roamed these corridors. While every other ward carried standard labels tied to general practice, C-17, cardiology, C-12, infectious disease, C-04, pediatric recovery, C-21 had no such designation. No specialty, no department, no documented purpose. It existed in the paperwork only briefly before vanishing entirely from the hospital's archives sometime in the late 1980s. But the physical door remained. Tall. Rusting at the hinges. Locked from the outside with a thick industrial bolt, as if whatever was inside needed to be kept from coming out rather than keeping outsiders from entering. Even now, decades after closure, the bolt looked newer than the surrounding frame, replaced, perhaps, not too long before the hospital shut down. Former employees claimed they used to hear things behind that door. Soft, rhythmic tapping. Sudden, sharp knocks that rattled through the corridor. Even faint voices, whispers that sounded too close to be imagination yet too impossible to acknowledge. One young resident, newly hired at the time, recalled hearing someone call his name from the other side, in a trembling voice that mirrored his own. When he responded, the whisper stopped instantly, as if the speaker had been waiting for him, listening to him, practicing the sound of his voice. Stories like these were dismissed publicly as the exaggerated tales of overtired staff working long night shifts. But privately, the administration issued quiet instructions: no trainee was to be assigned to that wing after dusk. Security was ordered to perform hourly checks, but only up to the point where the corridor narrowed toward Ward C-21. None were required to approach the door itself. Even janitors refused to go near it. According to internal rumors, one custodian had quit on the spot after claiming that the door shook violently while he was mopping nearby, yet in his report, security described the ward as sealed, untouched, and structurally sound. They never addressed his shaking hands, his pale expression, or the fact that he never returned to collect his final paycheck. Over time, the hospital staff learned to adapt. They rerouted nightly rounds. They assigned supply closets elsewhere. They simply pretended the wing didn't exist. But the patients knew about it. Some swore they heard crying. Others said they saw shadows moving under the door, long and thin like stretched silhouettes. One elderly patient repeatedly told her daughter, "They left someone inside. I heard him knocking. He kept asking for help." Doctors chalked it up to dementia. The family wasn't convinced. The most chilling detail of all was something only a handful of senior administrators knew: the hospital had once attempted to erase Ward C-21 entirely, not just physically, but historically. Renovation plans redrew the blueprints to remove that section of the building. Filing cabinets mysteriously lost documents referencing the ward. Employee handbooks quietly removed it from rotation lists. It was as though the hospital wanted future staff to believe the ward had never existed. And for the most part, they succeeded. Until one day, years after its closure, a routine governmental inspection would accidentally uncover a box of forgotten records, and reveal that something terrible had once taken place behind that steel door. Something the hospital hoped would never be found again. The investigation began the same way most buried histories do, by accident. A routine government inspection, scheduled decades after the hospital had shut its doors, brought 2 compliance officers into the forgotten East Wing. Their objective was simple: verify structural safety before the city repurposed the grounds. But as they walked deeper into the dust-heavy corridors, one of them noticed an old metal filing cabinet tucked behind collapsed ceiling tiles, its drawers warped and rusted shut. It didn't match the room, it looked older, heavier, intentionally hidden. It took both officers working together to pry the top drawer open. When it finally screeched free, what they saw inside should not have existed. Rows of manila folders, brittle with age, each stamped with the same ward designation the hospital later swore never existed, C-21. The inspection team didn't know the significance. They only knew they had stumbled onto something the hospital clearly didn't want found. As the folders were lifted, dust fell in thick clouds, revealing handwritten notes, faded memos, and incident reports typed on yellowing carbon paper. Some pages were incomplete, some were water-damaged, some were violently torn, as if someone had ripped out the parts they feared most. One memo in particular stood out. It was submitted by a nurse named Lena Vasquez, dated only 3 weeks before the hospital closed Ward C-21 permanently. The memo was brief, formal, but carried a tremor beneath the professional tone. She reported unusual disturbances during her night shift, malfunctioning intercoms, flickering lights confined only to the C-21 corridor, and what she described as persistent auditory anomalies difficult to assign to any identifiable source. But the most disturbing part was the final line of her statement, which looked as though it had been typed with shaking hands: recommend immediate review of ward assignment protocols. Current conditions are unsafe for staff. There was no signature. No supervisor notes. No follow-up documentation. It simply ended. The more the inspectors read, the stranger things became. A handwritten complaint by an orderly named Michael Farron described the ward as impossible to maintain and included a vague reference to patient behavior unaligned with recorded medical conditions. Another document, unsigned but stamped by administration, emphasized that night staff must avoid unnecessary engagement with Ward C-21 after 2300 hours. Why would a hospital create time restrictions for a ward? Why would staff be warned not to engage with it? When contacted for clarification, the hospital's former administrators responded with confusion. Their official archival database contained no record of a nurse Lena Vasquez ever being employed. No record of an orderly named Michael Farron. No record of Ward C-21. As far as their digital documents were concerned, these people, and the ward, simply didn't exist. But the physical files told a different story. Investigators dug deeper into the folders, discovering shift logs marked with Lena's and Michael's names. They found medication sheets signed by them, patient charts annotated by them. Their handwriting matched across multiple forms. Their employment was clearly real. What wasn't real, apparently, was the hospital's willingness to acknowledge them. It raised a chilling possibility: someone had gone through great effort to erase these individuals from the institution's history. Yet their testimonies had survived in this hidden cabinet, waiting for someone to find them. As the inspection team continued sorting through the papers, a pattern began to emerge. Every staff member assigned to C-21 had filed at least one incident report. Some were vague: unusual noises, equipment malfunction, patient unrest. Others were more direct, hinting at fear without explicitly naming its source. A few were downright desperate, written in hurried strokes: I won't go back there. Something is wrong inside that ward. They don't listen to us. They think we're exaggerating. C-21 needs to be shut down before someone gets hurt. One particular report from Michael was longer than the others. It described a night when he entered the ward alone after a patient call light began blinking, though, according to the census sheet, no patients were assigned to C-21 at the time. The corridor lights flickered repeatedly as he approached, and when he reached the doorway, the blinking stopped. The ward went silent. Then the intercom crackled. He heard breathing. Slow. Labored. Right next to his ear, though he was the only one present. When he stepped back, the intercom emitted a soft tapping sound, a rhythmic pattern that repeated 3 times before fading out. He requested reassignment the next morning. His request was denied. The deeper investigators reviewed, the more contradictions emerged in official statements made years later. Administrators claimed the ward had been vacant due to renovations, yet the documents showed active night shifts, patient monitoring, and medication logs. They claimed no staff had ever reported hazards, yet the filing cabinet contained stacks of warnings. They claimed the wing was structurally unsafe, yet photographs from the era showed it intact, operational, and in use. It became evident that a coordinated effort had been undertaken not just to shut down C-21, but to erase it from institutional memory. But why? What was so important, or so dangerous, inside that ward that decades of hospital leadership agreed to bury its existence? And what happened to the staff who tried to speak about it? The final discovery in the drawer added another layer of unease. Near the bottom lay a stack of shift logs, their dates spanning nearly a decade. The last entry was incomplete. It documented a night shift assigned to Lena and Michael, marked at 22:13. It listed routine tasks, down to the minute. But the final line stopped abruptly, ending mid-sentence. No explanation. No concluding signature. No evidence of what happened next. The remaining space on the page was torn away, leaving only jagged fibers where the paper had been ripped. It was the first tangible sign that the truth about Ward C-21 was not lost by accident. It was taken. The hospital's oldest blueprints showed Ward C-21 as a standard psychiatric recovery unit, small rooms, reinforced doors, wide observation windows. But the newly uncovered documents suggested something far more unsettling. Patients were brought into the ward, but very few were ever discharged. Their files rarely contained full histories, diagnoses, or even photographs. Instead, each folder was stamped with a thin red line across the top margin, as though marking them for a purpose no one dared to name. The earliest patient logs dated back to 1964, coinciding with a catastrophic local event, a chemical plant explosion that left dozens injured, traumatized, or unresponsive. The hospital struggled to manage the influx. Beds overflowed. Temporary triage tents were erected outside. Families waited in hallways for news. Amid the chaos, a group of unidentified survivors were quietly transferred into Ward C-21, segregated from the main building and assigned numbers instead of names. Their charts were filled with vague descriptors: severe trauma, unpredictable episodes, disrupted perception, requires isolation. But what stood out most were the personal items recovered decades later: a child's sketchbook filled with frantic drawings, letters that patients wrote but never sent, and a small journal belonging to a teenager whose case number appeared repeatedly in staff notes. These artifacts, found in locked drawers beneath layers of dust, offered a glimpse into lives that had been deliberately hidden. The teenage patient, known only as Case 214, documented his experiences in shaky handwriting. His entries began simple, almost hopeful. He wrote about the nurses who brought him meals, about the birds he could hear from the window, about wanting to go home. But over time, his writing shifted. The lines grew uneven. Words repeated. His sentences became fragmented, as though he was writing in a hurry, fearful that someone, or something, might interrupt him. One entry read, "I hear footsteps at night. Not in the hall. Inside the room. Like someone walking around my bed. When I open my eyes, no one is there." Another page described voices whispering to him, soft at first, then louder, overlapping, as if multiple people were speaking through the same breath. He insisted the staff dismissed his reports, telling him the sounds were symptoms of trauma. But he wrote again and again that the voices didn't sound imagined, they sounded real. Human. One of his final entries said, "I saw a shadow on the wall when the lights were off. It moved even when I didn't. I think it's trying to tell me something. The last page was ripped out entirely. Case 214 wasn't the only patient whose notes hinted at something unnatural within the ward. Another folder, belonging to an older woman identified as Case 198, contained scraps of paper filled with frantic scrawls. Many were illegible, but one message appeared repeatedly, almost obsessively: "They watch us even when the doors are locked." Staff logs from the era revealed repeated mentions of unusual patient behavior, but never specified details. One nurse wrote that several patients refused to sleep, insisting something moved in the room at night. Another reported that patients frequently complained of seeing figures pacing the hallway, figures the staff claimed they never saw. At first glance, it was possible to attribute these experiences to trauma-induced hallucinations. But the consistency across multiple sources, different ages, different backgrounds, different mental states, suggested something more disturbing. These were not isolated cases. They were patterns. Adding to the mystery, the ward's physical structure showed irregularities. The walls were thicker than standard construction guidelines. Doors were reinforced far beyond typical psychiatric safety regulations. Even the windows, narrow and barred, appeared designed not just to prevent escape, but to prevent intrusion. Why would a hospital need to build a ward like that? Some historians speculated that the early years of C-21 were part of an experimental program for managing severe psychological trauma. Others believed the hospital received government direction to isolate certain patients whose behaviors defied conventional explanation. But no formal documents confirmed either theory. Then there were the staff testimonies. One caretaker described hearing soft crying during his rounds, though every patient was asleep behind secured doors. Another claimed she once saw footprints on the freshly polished corridor floor, small, bare, and leading directly to a locked room. When she unlocked the door to check inside, the room was empty. The footprints were gone when she returned with another nurse, as if they had evaporated. More troubling were the unexplained disappearances. In one log, a patient was recorded as having been transferred to a neighboring facility. Yet no receiving hospital ever documented their arrival. Another patient's chart ended without a discharge summary. It simply stopped as if their story had been cut off mid-sentence, just like the torn shift logs in the inspection files. Families of these patients rarely received answers. Many were told their loved ones had been moved for specialized care. Others were informed of sudden deaths attributed to vague medical complications. Some families, suspicious of the inconsistencies, attempted to visit C-21 themselves but were turned away by administration, who claimed the wing was under quarantine or under renovation. Yet photographs from the time showed no signs of renovation. No construction work. No restricted access signs. The truth was that Ward C-21 was not being repaired, it was being concealed. By the late 1970s, staff morale plummeted. The ward's reputation spread quietly through break rooms and night shift whispers. New employees were warned: if you hear knocking after midnight, report it, but don't go toward it. If a patient calls from C-21 when the census shows no one assigned, ignore it. If the intercom activates on its own, unplug it and keep walking. Such warnings should have been absurd in a medical facility grounded in science. Yet the staff obeyed them. Fear replaced logic. Routine replaced curiosity. And slowly, C-21 became a place no one questioned, because questioning meant admitting something was wrong. When the hospital eventually shut the ward down, no official statement explained why. Records merely noted that C-21 was no longer required. Patients were quietly relocated or transferred into ambiguous programs. Staff assignments were reshuffled. Doors were locked. Lights were turned off. But the lingering feeling, of something unfinished, unresolved, unspoken, never left. What happened behind those reinforced walls? Why were patients kept in secrecy? Why were their voices silenced? Nurse Lena Vasquez had worked the night shift for nearly 6 years, but she never grew accustomed to the silence that swallowed the hospital after midnight. Most wards had some noise, distant coughing, a monitor beeping, soft chatter between exhausted nurses. But the hallway leading toward C-21 felt different. Silence wasn't just present there, it pressed against the skin, heavy and unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. Lena avoided that wing whenever she could. Everyone did. But the staffing shortages that winter were severe, and one evening, her supervisor informed her that her assignment had changed. She would be responsible for the East Wing night rounds, including the corridor that passed by C-21. She felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Her supervisor tried to smile as she handed over the shift papers, but even she avoided eye contact. "It's only for tonight," she said. "We're stretched thin. Just, stick to protocol. Stick to protocol." That was always the phrase they used when they didn't want to admit something was wrong. Lena signed the papers with a trembling hand. She began her shift at 11 p.m., moving through the building with practiced efficiency. She checked vitals, adjusted 4 lines, spoke softly to patients unable to sleep. But as the clock neared midnight, she found herself standing at the entrance of the East Corridor, staring down the long hallway that ended in the notorious steel door of Ward C-21. The lights flickered the moment she stepped forward. She froze. It happened again, only in that corridor. Never anywhere else. The bulbs hummed, dimmed, then flared back to full brightness. She swallowed hard and forced herself to continue. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing back toward her with a slight delay, as if the sound traveled farther than the physical space allowed. The air grew colder the deeper she walked, enough for her breath to fog faintly in front of her. Her first round passed without incident, though she noted a strange static interference on her pager. At 12:17 a.m., as she documented medication numbers near the supply closet, she heard it, a soft, intermittent beeping. She looked up. The intercom light above room C-21 flickered on. That was impossible. The entire intercom system for the ward had been disabled. She had seen the maintenance log herself. Yet the small green light blinked steadily, waiting for someone to answer. Lena pressed the button, her voice barely audible. "Hello." A low crackle hissed through the speaker. Then breathing. Slow. Labored. So close it felt as though someone was exhaling directly into her ear, not through a broken intercom line in an empty, sealed ward. "Who is this?" Lena whispered. The breathing stopped abruptly. The intercom light went dead. Her pulse hammered. She stepped back, gripping her clipboard tightly, and tried to steady her breath. She told herself the system must have malfunctioned again, though she knew better. C-21 didn't malfunction, it reacted. She hurried through the rest of her tasks, refusing to glance toward the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. But just as she reached the midpoint of the corridor, a faint metallic sound echoed behind her. Tap. Pause. Tap tap. Pause. Tap. She knew that rhythm. Every nurse did. Patients used it on bedside rails when they needed help. A universal signal. Her heart clenched. Someone was knocking. Slowly, she turned. The sound had come from C-21. The door stood motionless, its bolt locked tight. She told herself no one was inside. The census sheet had shown 0 assignments. And yet the knocking came again, gentle, almost pleading, as if someone were waiting on the other side. Against her better judgment, she took a step closer. The corridor lights flickered violently this time, plunging her into darkness for half a second before buzzing back on. She breathed sharply and stopped walking. "Is someone in there?" she called out. Her voice trembled. No response. Only another tap, this time softer, slower. Not mechanical. Not random. Deliberate. She reached for her radio, whispering for security, but the device emitted only static. A scratchy, distorted noise that rose and fell in an unsettling pattern, like a broken voice struggling to form words. She turned the dial, tapped the side, tried every channel, nothing. She was alone. The next few minutes felt like hours. She forced herself to resume her rounds, refusing to turn her back on the corridor for long. She told herself she would report everything at the end of her shift, that she only needed to get through a few more hours. At 2:43 a.m., she made her second pass through the wing. That was when she saw it. A figure. Standing at the far end of the hallway, near the steel door. It was still, motionless. Human-shaped, but indistinct in the dim light. Lena felt her breath catch. She blinked quickly, convinced her mind was playing tricks on her. When she opened her eyes again, the figure had shifted, just slightly, but enough to confirm it wasn't a shadow. Her legs felt weak. "Hello?" she said, though her voice cracked halfway. "If someone is down here, you shouldn't be." The figure didn't move. The lights flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, she heard footsteps, light, rapid, echoing toward her. When the lights snapped back on, the figure was gone. Lena stumbled backward, her lungs tightening with panic. She broke protocol and ran straight to the nurse's station, heart pounding against her ribs. Her colleague, an older nurse named Evelyn, looked up in alarm. "You're pale," Evelyn said. "Sit down." "What happened?" Lena tried to speak, but her voice failed her. The words felt stuck, tangled with fear. After several seconds, she finally managed to whisper, "There's someone in seat 21. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her eyes did, widening just a fraction, revealing a fear she tried to hide. She closed Lena's report folder gently and said, "We don't speak about that wing after midnight. You know that." "But I saw someone." "No," Evelyn said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You think you did. Everyone thinks they have at some point. The mind plays tricks down there." Lena shook her head violently. "It wasn't a trick. Someone was there, someone standing by the door." Evelyn hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Listen to me. That ward is sealed. Has been for years. Whatever you think you saw, it didn't come from inside." The implication chilled her. If it didn't come from inside, then where did it come from? Security reviewed the hallway cameras the next morning. Lena watched over their shoulders, nerves coiled tight. When the footage reached the moment she saw the figure, she leaned closer. The corridor remained empty. No shadow. No movement. No figure. She felt the bottom of her stomach drop. The guards exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. One of them quietly suggested the footage might have been partially corrupted due to faulty wiring. Lena didn't believe it. She could see the tension in their faces, the way they avoided looking at the screen for too long. They didn't believe it either. She filed her incident report at the end of her shift, describing every detail. The intercom. The knocking. The figure. The footsteps. Administration never responded. 3 days later, Lena requested reassignment from the night shift. Her request was approved without question. What she didn't know was that her final shift on C-21 would become one of the last documented interactions any staff member ever recorded about the ward, before the hospital locked the steel door for good. For years, Michael Farron carried himself like a man who never quite escaped the place he worked in. Even after he left the hospital, even after Ward C-21 was sealed, people said he walked with a heaviness in his shoulders, as if something unseen clung to him. His neighbors often saw him awake at odd hours, sitting alone on his porch, staring into the distance with sleepless eyes. Those who spoke to him described a man who was polite, gentle, but burdened, haunted by memories he never shared. But the investigators who uncovered his old notes began to piece together a truth far more disturbing. Michael wasn't just frightened of Ward C-21. He was guilty about it. He joined the hospital in the mid-1970s as an orderly, idealistic, hopeful, eager to help people. He had no formal training in psychology or medicine. What he did have was a willingness to work night shifts, handle difficult patients, and follow instructions without question. For an institution dealing with overflow and chaos after the 1964 disaster, that made him invaluable. Yet Michael's early personnel forms hinted at something unusual. In one document, his supervisor praised him for being remarkably compliant and unafraid of high-risk assignments. In another, he was recommended for special rotation, though the rotation lacked any official description. When investigators compared these notes with the hidden C-21 files, a chilling connection emerged. Michael had been assigned to the ward long before most other staff, back when patients still occupied the rooms, when their screams still echoed down the hall at night. One surviving transcript, handwritten by Michael, revealed a glimpse of his mindset at the time. I believed the doctors knew what they were doing. I believed what they told me. That the patients were unstable. That the noises were symptoms. That the shadows I saw weren't real. I thought obedience was the same as goodness. The more investigators read, the more his remorse became clear. He described nights where patients cried through the walls, begging not to be left alone. Nights when certain rooms in the ward seemed to vibrate faintly, as if someone, or something, were pacing endlessly inside. Nights when he felt eyes on him, tracking him from the cracks beneath the doors. One entry recounted an incident he would later refer to only as the mistake. According to his notes, a doctor overseeing C-21 had ordered him to assist with a new treatment protocol. The document didn't name the patient, only their case number. Michael's job was to bring the patient into a room deeper within the ward, room 5E, one that did not exist on the blueprints found later. Michael wrote, the door to 5E was different. Heavier. Reinforced. I had never noticed it before, though I'd walked the hall 100 times. It wasn't there, and then suddenly it was. Inside the room stood a narrow bed, restraints, and an array of machines covered with cloths. The doctor instructed Michael to secure the patient, who was trembling, whispering something he couldn't understand. He tried to steady the patient, but the man recoiled, repeating the same phrase over and over, not again. Not again. Please. Michael didn't know what the phrase meant. He followed orders anyway. He helped strap the man to the bed, feeling the patient's body jerk in panic beneath his hands. He wrote in the margins, that was the moment I knew. He wasn't afraid of us. He was afraid of the room. The treatment that night was never described in full, but Michael hinted at lights that flickered violently, machinery that hummed with a frequency that made his skull ache. And a sensation, impossible to explain, that something in the room was watching him from a corner where no shadows should have formed. He left 5E shaken. The patient's screams echoed long after the door closed. The next morning, Michael asked the doctor about the patient's condition. The doctor simply said, there is no patient. A week later, the man's file vanished from the hospital system. Michael was ordered never to mention the event again. Years passed, but Michael could never forget the terrified look in the patient's eyes. He could never forget the sound, a rapid, rhythmic tapping, that followed him down the hallway after the procedure. He tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, a symptom of stress, a trick of the years. That illusion broke one night when he went to lock up the ward. As he turned the key in the bolt of the steel door, something on the other side knocked back. 3 taps. He dropped the keys. From that night on, Michael refused to step foot inside C-21 unless forced. Colleagues noticed changes in him. He grew withdrawn. His hands trembled when paperwork mentioned the ward. He avoided eye contact when discussing assignments. He lost weight. He stopped sleeping. But no one questioned him directly. In those years, C-21 was a subject everyone tiptoed around, as if addressing it openly could summon something unwanted. Eventually, Michael recorded an audio confession, a tape found decades later among the hidden files. His voice on the recording was hoarse, exhausted, threaded with regret. "I should have said something," he whispered. "I should have told someone what they were doing. What they were testing. What we all heard every night. But they told us it was for research. That it was for the greater good. And I believed them. I helped them." A long silence followed. Then he added the words that would become the most quoted line from his testimony: "We should have burned the entire wing." Those who heard the tape felt the weight of his fear, not the fear of death, or ghosts, or memories, but the fear of knowing he had been part of something unforgivable. Something he couldn't undo. Michael disappeared shortly after the hospital closed the ward. His name never appeared in any subsequent employment records. Some said he moved away, trying to rebuild his life in a small quiet town. Others believed he checked himself into a mental facility after suffering a breakdown. But one thing was certain: whatever happened inside Ward C-21 had stained him permanently. And the truth he tried to bury was about to resurface, piece by piece, like a warning rising from beneath the floorboards of a place that refused to stay forgotten. The more investigators pulled at the threads of Ward C-21's past, the more a disturbing picture began to take shape, one that suggested the hospital had not simply mishandled patient care, but had participated in a secretive psychological program designed to push human minds to their breaking point. The recovered files referenced it only once by name: Project Quiet Mind. At first, the title sounded benign, almost hopeful, something associated with therapy, healing, recovery. But the pages that followed stripped away any illusion of benevolence. This was not a treatment plan. It was an experiment. A series of trials conducted on patients who were never informed, never asked for consent, and never given the option to refuse. The earliest document was typed in stiff, clinical language, objective, to evaluate the effectiveness of induced cognitive quieting in patients experiencing severe trauma-related disturbances. Method: environmental modulation through controlled sensory deprivation and targeted auditory recalibration. In simpler terms, the program aimed to silence trauma by overwhelming or disrupting the mind's natural processing patterns. But the details were far more sinister than the abstract wording suggested. The files contained diagrams of sealed rooms equipped with heavy insulation, narrow beds, mechanical restraints, and audio devices capable of emitting specific frequencies. There were notes about prolonged exposure, night cycle distortions, and behavioral stress testing. Many pages were removed, leaving behind torn edges, evidence of information someone desperately wanted gone. But enough remained to reconstruct what had happened behind those reinforced walls. Patients selected for Quiet Mind were brought into the ward late at night, often sedated or too disoriented to resist. Staff were instructed not to speak to them during transfers. Verbal interaction was considered disruptive to baseline assessment. Once inside, the patients were placed into isolated chambers where lights remained either fully off or painfully bright, alternating unpredictably. One chilling line in the protocol read: "Monitor patient reactions to auditory stimuli. Escalate intensity as needed." Another: "In the event of agitation, proceed with secondary confinement method." Secondary confinement method. The file did not define it. But the staff logs hinted at what it entailed: restraints, forced sedation, and extended isolation. Michael had been present for many of these sessions, often under the belief that he was assisting with therapeutic procedures. His notes revealed he began questioning the ethics of the program early on, but any concerns he raised were dismissed with familiar lines: "The patients are unstable. We are helping them. They are not equipped to understand their own needs." The program began modestly, with a handful of patients. But within 2 years, the number increased drastically, aligning with a spike in internal transfers from other wards, patients whose conditions suddenly required special handling. Some of these patients had previously shown promising recovery. After entering Quiet Mind, their charts documented rapid declines, hallucinations, violent fear responses, dissociation, sudden muteness. One nurse wrote in a panicked scrawl, "They are breaking. We are breaking them." Another page, signed anonymously, described what happened when the experiment escalated. They brought in new machines. Ones that make the walls shake. The sound goes through you, not around you. The patients scream before it even starts. But the most alarming detail was one that recurred across multiple staff reports, mentions of cross-contamination. At first, the phrase appeared only in passing, possible cross-contamination event noted. Monitor for recurring cross-contamination. The context was unclear. Contamination of what? Infection? Equipment? Protocol? That question remained unanswered until investigators examined a partially burned document that had survived in the back of the filing cabinet. The text was faded and warped by heat damage, but a few sentences could still be read. Unintended psychological transference observed. Containment breach not physical in nature. Symptoms manifest in staff even when outside testing environment. It became clear that Quiet Mind wasn't merely destabilizing patients, it was destabilizing the people who worked there. Staff began reporting insomnia, unexplained anxiety, auditory hallucinations, and in rare cases, episodes of disorientation similar to those experienced by the patients. Some claimed they heard whispers when alone in empty rooms. Others said they saw movement in their peripheral vision during late-night rounds. One orderly described feeling as though someone stood behind him, even when he knew he was alone. Administration initially dismissed these complaints as stress-related. But eventually, they adopted a new policy: rotate personnel frequently, never allowing any one staff member prolonged exposure to C-21. This was meant to reduce the psychological burden, but it also served another purpose: it kept anyone from noticing the patterns forming under their noses. Despite the growing problems, Quiet Mind continued. The project's overseers insisted the anomalies were part of the process. They claimed the brain had to unlearn trauma before rebuilding. They argued that the more resistance the mind showed, the closer they were to breakthroughs. Their confidence bordered on obsession. Meanwhile, the patients deteriorated rapidly. Records showed that one man became catatonic after just 3 days, his eyes wide open, fixed on the corner of his room. A young woman tore her fingernails against the reinforced glass, insisting something was trapped inside with her. Another patient screamed until his voice gave out, yet his mouth continued to form shapes long after sound stopped. These events were chalked up to progression of symptoms, even though many patients had shown improvement before their transfers into the ward. Then came the night mentioned repeatedly in surviving papers, the night everything began to unravel. It was labeled simply, cross-contamination event. Very few details remained in the files, but multiple sources mentioned alarms being triggered simultaneously across the ward. A power fluctuation plunged the hall into periods of darkness. Several patients reportedly broke restraints, something deemed physically impossible given their conditions. Staff claimed they heard voices blending together, rising and falling like a single collective breath. Michael's audio confession hinted at what he witnessed. It wasn't just the patients reacting. The room itself felt alive. Like it was resonating. The event ended abruptly, though no record described how. In the aftermath, 2 patients vanished from the system entirely. Their beds were found empty, and their charts were removed from the files. No death certificates were issued. No transfer papers existed. Administrators held an emergency meeting the next morning. Quiet Mind was suspended indefinitely. Ward C-21 was shut down soon after. Staff were ordered not to discuss anything they had witnessed. Those who asked questions found themselves reassigned, reprimanded, or encouraged to seek personal wellness leave. All remaining Quiet Mind documents were scheduled for destruction. But someone, likely a staff member who feared the truth would disappear, saved pieces of the files, hiding them in the old cabinet investigators would later discover. The remnants revealed a final unsettling note at the bottom of an unsigned page: the phenomenon is not contained. Recommend isolation of the entire ward. Do not attempt re-entry. The mystery deepened when investigators realized many references to Quiet Mind ended mid-sentence, cut off exactly the same way Lena's shift logs and Michael's final report had been. Someone had systematically removed information. Someone had tried to bury the truth so deeply that no one would ever dig it up again. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, especially in a place where the walls themselves seem to remember. And whatever Quiet Mind unleashed that night, whatever the staff heard, saw, or carried with them afterward, was not finished yet. It remained sealed behind the steel door at the end of the hallway. Waiting. The investigation into Quiet Mind should have ended when the files ran out of pages. Most of the documents were damaged, removed, or burned beyond recognition, as if someone wanted the truth to suffocate before it ever reached daylight. But one phrase appeared too many times to ignore: cross-contamination event. There were no official records explaining it, no surviving reports detailing what happened inside the ward that night. What existed instead were fragments, short statements scribbled in margins, anonymous notes tucked between memos, and half-whispered testimonies recorded years later. A forensic historian named Dr. Mara Ivers spent months piecing these fragments together like a puzzle with missing edges. She specialized in uncovering erased histories, medical trials, secret experiments, institutional cover-ups. But even she admitted that event was unlike anything she had studied. It's as if, she said, the building itself swallowed the evidence. Her reconstruction of the night began hours before the outbreak of chaos. The patients in Ward C-21 had been unusually restless that evening. Logs from nearby wards noted distant noises, metal clanging, doors rattling, and something described as a low, droning hum reverberating through the walls. Staff assumed it was machinery powering up for another Quiet Mind session. The experiment often involved equipment that caused structural vibrations. But what unsettled them was the timing. No procedure had been scheduled. Yet the machines had turned on. Around 11:58 p.m., Nurse Holloway, assigned to a different ward, reported hearing a scream echo from the far end of the East Wing. She assumed it came from the psychiatric unit, but according to census logs, no patients were assigned there. She wrote that the sound was raw, unrestrained, not like a panic attack, like someone being torn open emotionally. Minutes later, the first alarm triggered. A red emergency light, long abandoned, dusty, and believed non-functional, flashed above the C-21 corridor. Staff who rushed toward the area stopped abruptly at the threshold, unwilling to step into the narrowing hallway that grew darker the closer one came to the steel door. The lights flickered there more violently than usual, plunging the passage in and out of shadow. Then the second alarm sounded. This one came from the electrical grid. The power meter spiked, dipping and surging repeatedly, as if the building itself were gasping. Hall lights dimmed. Intercoms crackled even in wings where they hadn't worked in years. Radios became useless, filled with static and whispered fragments of sound no one could interpret. Staff recalled hearing layered voices, overlapping like multiple conversations happening at once, though not a single word was identifiable. Dr. Ivers believed this was the key moment, when the contamination spread beyond patient containment. Whatever had been happening inside Ward C-21 was no longer confined. According to the scraps of testimony from surviving staff, the ward doors began shaking, not violently, but steadily, rhythmically. A slow pulse. The sound moved from room to room, almost like something pacing. Some nurses said it reminded them of someone knocking from the inside, testing the strength of the reinforced steel. Others swore the knocking came from between the walls. At approximately 12:17 a.m., the main security alarm activated. This should have initiated a full lockdown, but instead, the command panel malfunctioned, and the opposite occurred. Several interior doors unlocked simultaneously. A draft swept through the corridor, cold enough to make breath visible. Someone later described the air as electrically charged, like standing under a live cable. In the confusion, 2 staff members attempted to enter the ward. They made it only a few steps inside before stumbling back out, claiming they felt pressure, like a crowd pushing from all directions. Yet the hallway was empty. A third staff member reported hearing soft crying echo from somewhere deep within the ward. The sound of a young boy, repeating a single phrase, "It's happening again." This matched the journal entries of Case 214, the teenage patient whose writings described footsteps in his room at night and a shadow that moved independently of the light. The crying grew louder. Then everything erupted at once. All remaining emergency alarms triggered. The lights shut off completely, leaving the wing in utter darkness for 19 seconds. When they returned, half the ward's doors were open. But no patients were seen inside. Bed sheets lay on the floor, tangled as if someone had climbed out in a hurry. Restraint clasps hung undone. One mattress appeared to be sliced cleanly down the center, though no tool capable of doing that was found. A staff member named Adkins later recounted, "It wasn't that they escaped. It was like they weren't there anymore. Like something erased them out of the room." The strangest piece of evidence came from a clipboard dropped near the nurse's station. Written on it, in handwriting that did not match any staff on duty, were the words, "You shouldn't have opened the door." But no door had been opened. At least, not by any staff member. The most chilling artifact emerged decades later from a sealed evidence box, a reel-to-reel audio tape dated the same night. It had no label, no owner, and no accompanying documentation. When restored, the recording revealed faint sounds, intermittent tapping, low murmurs, distant footsteps, and then, near the end, a voice whispering several words. The voice was quiet, breathy, impossibly close. "Let me out." Analysts could not determine whether the whisper belonged to a patient, a staff member, or something else entirely. The tape ended abruptly with a loud crack, as if the microphone had been knocked over. What happened after the alarm ceased remained murky. Most of the staff from that night refused to speak about it. Some transferred hospitals within weeks. Others retired early. A few left the medical field altogether and never returned. What little could be pieced together suggested that 2 patients were unaccounted for after the event. No death records were filed. No transfer papers existed. Their charts were removed. Their belongings disappeared. Their names were erased from the hospital's official census. Investigators believed they were the ones involved in the event, but Dr. Ivers disagreed. She believed it wasn't the patients who caused the incident. She believed the experiment had opened something inside the ward, something the patients had sensed long before the staff had. Something that grew stronger with every quiet mind session, feeding on confusion, fear, and fractured thoughts. Something that seeped beyond the walls during event. In her final notes before closing her review, she wrote, "It was not a containment failure. It was a release." And like every other truth linked to Ward C-21, what exactly was released that night remained lost to torn pages, silenced voices, and a building whose walls remembered more than any surviving document ever could. What was certain, however, was this: after event, Ward C-21 ceased operating completely. Equipment was removed. Access was restricted. The steel door was reinforced, bolted, and sealed shut. The hospital quietly rewrote its records, erasing C-21 from every chart, blueprint, and directory. But even decades later, those who walked past the corridor swore they still heard something behind that door. Soft tapping. A faint hum. A whisper too quiet to understand. Waiting. The aftermath of events should have ignited a full-scale investigation, one that exposed every secret buried within Ward C-21. But instead, something far stranger happened. The hospital moved with silent, coordinated urgency to bury the truth. Not just to cover up a mistake, but to erase an entire chapter of its existence. What followed was not chaos, but a systematic effort so swift and deliberate that it was clear the administrators had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. The first sign came the morning after the incident. Work orders were issued to maintenance staff with simple but chilling instructions: seal the ward. Not clean it, not repair it, not assess it. Seal it. Cover the door with reinforced metal plating. Weld shut any accessible vents. Disconnect power. Shut down water lines. Remove all signage identifying the corridor. A custodian who later spoke to investigators recalled watching as a team of administrators arrived at the East Wing. They carried briefcases, wore gloves, and discussed the situation with a clinical detachment that disturbed him. At no point did any of them ask about the missing patients. At no point did they mention the alarms, the screams, or the shattered equipment still scattered across the floors. Their only concern was containment. Within 24 hours, confidential memos were sent to department heads instructing them to redirect all inquiries about the East Wing to senior administrators. A strict non-disclosure protocol was enacted. Employees were warned that any comments about C-21 could result in immediate termination. Some staff described the atmosphere as militarized, with security officers stationed at hallway intersections, preventing anyone from approaching the sealed door. But even the administrators couldn't erase everything. Fragments of truth still clung to the building itself: transfer logs that didn't match, maintenance reports that contradicted renovation schedules, patient charts that abruptly stopped mid-treatment. The inconsistencies piled up, forming a quiet rebellion against the institution's attempt to rewrite its own history. One of the clearest contradictions involved patient transfers. Officially, C-21 had been empty for years, according to administrative reports. Yet medication records showed nightly dosing for at least 4 individuals during the months leading up to event. Staff signatures confirmed this. None of the patients appeared in the hospital census, and no attending physicians were listed for their cases. When questioned decades later, former administrators insisted the logs were clerical errors. But the signatures were real, the timings too specific, and the handwriting matched staff assigned to the ward. These were not errors. These were people. People who had vanished without a trace. Another inconsistency emerged from the death certificates archived in the city's public records office. The hospital had filed several death notices that year, each vague, each attributing death to cardiac arrest during sedation. The causes were always the same. The times were always late at night. And the bodies, according to internal notes, were handled by special transport. No autopsies were recorded. No family notifications were documented. When one investigator attempted to track down the listed next of kin for a supposed deceased patient, he discovered the family had received no notice of death. They believed their son had been transferred for long-term care. They had never been told otherwise. But the most damning evidence of a cover-up was the destruction orders. Buried among payroll receipts and supply requisitions was a directive marked priority instructing maintenance personnel to dispose of all equipment removed from Ward C-21. The instruction specifically mentioned non-standard auditory devices and experimental containment units. There was no explanation of what these terms referred to, no diagrams, no photographs, just an urgent request to eliminate anything tied to quiet mind. The items were transported to a remote disposal site. Records indicated incineration. Still, a few items slipped through. A rusted metal restraint clasp found in a storage room. A broken audio transducer discarded behind a cabinet. A stack of patient wristbands stuffed into a torn envelope. Small artifacts, forgotten, overlooked, but enough to suggest the ward had been operating far outside the boundaries of medical ethics. What the hospital couldn't erase was the way people reacted in the years that followed. Staff who had worked near C-21 rarely spoke of it, but when they did, their voices carried the weight of old fear. Some recalled feeling watched when walking the East Wing, even after it had been sealed. Others claimed the air grew colder near the welded door, enough to make the hairs on their arms rise. A security guard from the late 80s described hearing movement inside the locked corridor, soft footsteps pacing back and forth, like someone trapped in a small space, trying to keep themselves from losing their mind. He filed a noise complaint, but the administration dismissed it as old pipes shifting. Years later, when interviewed again, he shook his head. "I know the difference between pipes and footsteps," he said quietly. Someone was in there. But perhaps the most haunting testimony came from a nurse who worked the final shift before the wing was sealed. She remembered seeing a flicker of light through the small window of one of the interior doors, a brief flash, like someone striking a match. When she approached, the light disappeared. She left quickly, feeling sick to her stomach. She never returned to that wing, not even to collect belongings from her old locker. You could always tell who had worked near C-21. Their eyes carried a heaviness, a reluctance, as if remembering too much could pull something back into the present. The hospital's reputation slowly deteriorated over the next decade. Rumors circulated among staff, then spread to the community, then became urban legends whispered among local teenagers exploring the grounds after dark. C-21 became synonymous with everything the hospital didn't want to acknowledge: fear, experimentation, erasure. Administrators did their best to silence the stories, but fear has a way of outliving the things that inspire it. And the sealed door remained. Even after the hospital shut down, even after the building decayed and the paint peeled from the walls, that door stayed intact, cold, solid, as though it still served a purpose. The cover-up succeeded on paper. But not in memory. And certainly not in the building itself. Because long after the last employee left, long after the files were shredded and the lights switched off, the workers who occasionally visited the abandoned facility for inspections claimed one eerie detail remained unchanged: when the wind was still. When the night was quiet. And when the hallway was empty. You could still hear something behind the sealed steel door. A soft, deliberate tapping. Just like the patients described. Just like the staff once heard. Just like the building refused to forget. Decades passed before anyone stepped inside the hospital again. Nature had reclaimed most of the building, vines crawled through cracked windows, paint peeled in long curls, and dust coated every forgotten surface. The once bright hallways now felt like tunnels into another world, one that had been suspended in time. The city planned to demolish the hospital eventually, but bureaucratic delays kept the structure standing long enough for urban explorers to discover it. At first, only a few dared to enter: teenagers seeking cheap thrills, photographers chasing decay, conspiracy enthusiasts hoping to uncover the truth behind local rumors. But the deeper they ventured, the more they all agreed on one thing: the air inside the building felt wrong. It was colder than it should have been. Too still. Too heavy. Like the walls were holding their breath. One group of explorers, calling themselves Nightpulse, documented the experience on camera, though most of the footage never saw the light of day. Their goal was to film the entire East Wing, a part of the hospital locals warned them to avoid. They assumed the warnings were just echoes of old ghost stories. They were wrong. As they made their way through the dark corridors, their flashlights revealed remnants of the past: a wheelchair lying on its side, surgical gowns strewn across the floor, children's drawings pinned crookedly to a wall. Every object seemed frozen mid-motion, as if dropped suddenly and never reclaimed. But what disturbed them most was how perfectly preserved Ward C-21 appeared compared to the rest of the hospital. While entire sections of the building had collapsed or rotted, the corridor leading to the sealed steel door showed almost no damage. No broken tiles. No mold creeping along the walls. No graffiti from previous explorers. It was as if time had avoided this hallway, refusing to touch it. "Guys, does it feel colder here?" one explorer whispered on the recording. The temperature drop was immediate. Their breath became faintly visible, hanging in the air like clouds of fog. One member checked the digital thermometer they carried. It had dropped nearly 20 degrees in less than a minute. They continued walking despite the growing unease. The floor beneath them creaked, but the sound echoed strangely, as though bouncing off walls farther away than the corridor allowed. The acoustics were wrong, delayed, stretched, hollow. "Feels like this place goes on forever," another said, pointing the camera toward the dark corridor ahead. The camera didn't capture anything unusual at first. But when one of the explorers reviewed the footage later, she noticed something chilling: the shadows didn't match their movements. One shadow lingered longer than it should have, hanging still even as the group walked past it. The explorers didn't see it in the moment. But the camera did. Halfway down the hallway, they found something no one expected: a patient file. It lay in the center of the floor, illuminated by their flashlights, perfectly clean, no dust, no water damage, no signs of age. The paper was crisp, the ink unfaded, as though someone had placed it there moments before they arrived. The name on the file had been blacked out, replaced with a number, 214. Inside were fragments of journal entries, sketches, and behavioral observations. Most pages were incomplete, ripped, or missing entirely. But one line was circled in heavy pen strokes: "They move when the lights go off. They know when you're alone." A nearby drawer, still bolted shut, rattled faintly when one explorer touched it. He pulled his hand back immediately, insisting he felt something cold on the other side of the metal, like fingertips pressing outward. The others laughed nervously, assuming he was trying to scare them. But his widened eyes told a different story. As they reached the end of the corridor, they finally saw the infamous steel door of C-21. It looked almost new. Untouched. Untarnished by rust or time. The bolts were thick, the welds unbroken, the metal smooth beneath layers of dust. Yet something was wrong. There were marks on the door, long, shallow scratches, like someone had dragged their nails across the surface again and again. Some scratches overlapped. Others trailed downward in trembling, uneven lines. "Why does it look like someone was trying to get out?" one explorer murmured. Another whispered, "Or trying to get in." Their voices echoed down the corridor in a distorted way, as if repeating themselves in whispers several seconds after they spoke. One explorer covered her ears, insisting she heard someone breathing behind her, but no one else heard it. Then, the first knock came. Soft. Faint. But unmistakable. The group froze. Their camera lights flicked, casting jerky shadows across the door. Another knock. A third. Rhythmic. Patient. Too precise to dismiss as building noise. "Back up," someone whispered. "We need to go." But curiosity pulled at them. One member, the most daring of the group, stepped closer and placed his hand gently on the cold metal surface. The moment his skin touched the steel, his breath hitched. "It's warm," he said quietly. The others didn't believe him until they touched it themselves. The door, which looked colder than ice, radiated a subtle, unnatural heat, like the warmth of breath or a living body behind it. Suddenly, the intercom above the door crackled to life. A soft static hiss filled the hallway. None of the explorers dared move. The intercom shouldn't have worked. The hospital had been disconnected from the grid for decades. Then a sound emerged through the static, faint but clear enough to send terror shooting down their spines. It was tapping. The same pattern. Tap, 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 tap. One explorer, shaking, whispered, "It's the same pattern from the reports, the same one staff heard before the ward was shut down." The tapping grew louder. Faster. Something on the other side was responding, matching the rhythm of their panicked breaths, almost mimicking it. Then, through the static, a whisper broke through. Just one word. "Hello." The explorers ran. Their footsteps pounded through the corridor, echoing in disjointed rhythms. The air grew colder with each step, and the lights flickered violently, threatening to plunge them into darkness. One tripped, scraping her palms against the floor, but the others pulled her up without slowing down. When they finally burst into the main hall, the temperature returned to normal. The static stopped. The intercom died. The building fell silent, as though the east wing had never stirred. Later, when the group reviewed the footage, they noticed something horrifying. As they ran, the camera caught a faint silhouette near the end of the corridor, right by the steel door. It wasn't human-shaped in any normal way. It was stretched, distorted, as if caught between frames of motion. And just before the final flicker of light, it took one step forward. That single frame was enough to convince the group never to return to the hospital. They deleted most of the footage, keeping only a few blurry images as proof it wasn't a hallucination. But the story spread. People whispered about the explorers who heard tapping behind the sealed door. And some, especially those who remembered the hospital's darkest days, weren't surprised. Because the sound they described was identical to the ones nurses had heard decades earlier. Identical to the patient logs. Identical to the audio reel from Quiet Mind. Whatever had happened in C-21 had not ended when the ward was sealed. Something was still there. Waiting in the dark. The truth behind Ward C-21 did not come from a single document, a confession, or a witness. It emerged slowly, painfully, through the intersection of testimonies, lost tapes, torn pages, and the strange, undeniable experiences of anyone who dared to enter the hospital long after it had been abandoned. Every clue pointed toward one central, haunting reality: the thing sealed behind that steel door wasn't a patient, or a ghost, or a hallucination. It was something the Quiet Mind experiment had created. Or awakened. Investigators eventually pieced together a pattern in the fragments of evidence, a progression of symptoms that began with the patients, then spread to the staff, and then seemed to detach entirely from human origin. Laughter heard in empty hallways. Shadows that moved in the wrong direction. Subtle distortions in audio equipment. Repeating taps that mirrored human rhythms. All of it pointed to something that behaved like a presence, but not like a person. The missing logs from Quiet Mind, though incomplete, offered the closest thing to a scientific explanation. The experiment attempted to manipulate neural activity by subjecting patients to extreme sensory deprivation while exposing them to frequency-based stimuli designed to suppress traumatic memories. But instead of quieting the mind, the frequencies seemed to destabilize it, fracturing perception, amplifying subconscious fears, creating auditory and visual distortions. The human brain, pushed beyond its limits, started projecting. But the projections didn't stay inside the patients' minds. Over time, multiple staff members reported seeing identical hallucinations: shadows standing in the same corner, figures pacing the same path, whispers forming the same fragmented words. These similarities could not have been coincidental. They suggested a shared external phenomenon. It was as though the trauma, fear, and mental fragmentation produced by the experiment had coalesced into something autonomous, something that learned, adapted, and echoed the thoughts around it. A presence born of fractured minds. It began with the patients, the most vulnerable, the most exposed. Their journals revealed a steady decline into terror. Case 214 wrote of footsteps circling his bed, a shadow that moved independently of him, a voice whispering from the ceiling vent. Others described feeling watched even when alone, hearing breathing that wasn't their own, seeing words appear on fogged glass without touching it. But the most disturbing were the entries indicating the entity, or whatever phenomenon the experiment had birthed, was evolving. One patient wrote, "It changed its shape today. It learned mine." Another, "It knows when I'm awake. It listens when I cry." The staff didn't escape its influence. Many reported identical sensory distortions: voices in empty rooms, someone whispering their name from behind them, lights flickering only in their presence. Their mental breakdowns follow the same pattern as the patients, as though whatever had formed inside C-21 had expanded beyond the confines of the experimental chambers. By the time event occurred, the phenomenon had grown strong enough to disrupt electrical systems and trigger alarms on its own. It responded to movement, light changes, and emotional states. Some believed it fed on fear, others believed it simply mimicked whatever it absorbed. One recovered note described it chillingly and succinctly: "It is not a ghost. It is a reflection. A distortion." A mind without a body. What happened during event wasn't an escape. It was a merging. The boundaries between hallucination and reality blurred to the point of collapse. Staff saw things they shouldn't have been able to see. Patients reacted to stimuli no one else perceived. And when the power flickered into darkness, multiple witnesses described seeing shapes, thin, stretched, flickering at the edge of the light, moving with intention. Not random. Not chaotic. Searching. 2 patients disappeared that night. The facility blamed clerical error, fabrication, even staff negligence. But the truth was more horrifying: their bodies were never found because their bodies weren't needed. The phenomenon didn't kill in the traditional sense, it consumed identity, memory, consciousness. Their final screams weren't a call for help. They were the last moments of individuality being overwritten by something created deep within the ward. When investigators later studied the steel door, they noticed faint indentations at roughly shoulder height, marks consistent with hands pressing outward. But the welds were intact. Nothing had opened the door. And yet the pressure came from inside. The door was not meant to keep anyone out. It was meant to keep something in. And it wasn't the patients. The final revelation surfaced only when a surviving technician from Quiet Mind came forward in an unrecorded, anonymous interview. His voice trembled as he spoke, recounting details he had buried for decades. The experiment didn't fail, he whispered. It worked exactly as they thought it would. They wanted to silence trauma. Strip it away. Remove the weight of memory. But trauma isn't something you can erase. It has to go somewhere. He paused, his breathing shaking. So it went into the walls. The technician described moments when he walked past C-21 and felt emotions that weren't his: panic, grief, unbearable dread, pressing against him like a physical force. He believed the experiment had ripped everything dark and unprocessed from the patients' minds, leaving those emotions suspended, unanchored, accumulating in the air like static electricity. Over time, that suspended psychological residue developed a kind of structure. Not fully alive, not fully conscious, but aware enough to imitate human presence. Aware enough to knock on doors. Aware enough to whisper. Aware enough to wait. The technician's final words were the most haunting: "We didn't create a monster. We created a mirror. A mirror that reflects only what people fear most." When he was asked why the door remained sealed even after the hospital closed, he answered almost immediately: to keep it from attaching to anyone else. To this day, the steel door remains untouched, the bolts unbroken, the corridor silent except for the faint echoes of what it once held. Construction workers who entered the building during preliminary demolition plans claimed they felt vibrations in the floor near the east wing. Some refused to continue working after hearing tapping from the other side of the sealed door. And when one worker dared place his ear against the metal, he heard breathing. Soft. Slow. Close. Exactly like the breathing Nurse Lena heard decades earlier through the intercom. The phenomenon had not faded. It had not weakened. It was waiting. And it remembered every voice that had ever spoken its name. Long after the hospital's final lights were extinguished and its hallways surrendered to dust and silence, something remained inside the walls, something that refused to be forgotten. Decades passed, but the memory of Ward C-21 clung stubbornly to local rumors, whispered stories, and the few surviving records that escaped destruction. The truth had been buried, but not erased. It lingered like a bruise that never fully healed. For the investigators who spent years piecing together the fragments, the story did not end with a sealed door. Their research led them through abandoned corridors, cold archives, and long interviews with aging staff whose eyes dimmed with fear at the mere mention of C-21. Each secret uncovered felt like a small victory, but also a warning, because every revelation carried the echo of something they could not name. Something the hospital tried desperately to silence. The most painful part was realizing how many lives had been quietly swallowed by the ward, patients whose names were erased, whose files vanished, whose families were left with unanswered questions. Their stories were never told, never mourned, never given closure. They were lost not because they disappeared into thin air, but because someone decided their suffering didn't deserve a place in the records. And the staff, those who had walked the night shifts, who felt the unnatural cold spread across their skin, who heard breathing through disabled speakers, carried the burden of those memories long after they left the hospital. Many never spoke about what they experienced. Some claimed they didn't remember. Others confessed they remembered too well. One retired nurse, interviewed in her late 70s, summed it up with trembling hands: "You don't forget something like C-21. You learn to pretend you have. That's the only way to sleep." Her words lingered with the investigators, a reminder that trauma doesn't vanish, it hides, festers, reshapes itself. Just like the phenomenon inside the ward. When demolition crews finally assessed the hospital decades after its closure, they approached the East Wing with caution. Most of the building had crumbled from neglect, floors buckled, ceilings collapsed, windows shattered. But C-21 stood strangely intact. The steel door remained sealed, uncorroded, almost gleaming beneath layers of dust. Some workers joked about it. Others refused to go near it. A few walked past the corridor quickly, as if afraid something might reach out from behind the door. One worker claimed he heard tapping when he passed, a gentle, rhythmic sound that seemed to sync with his footsteps. Another swore he felt warmth radiating from the metal despite the freezing air around him. When the foreman ordered the corridor off-limits, none of the workers complained. They were relieved. The demolition plan stalled soon after. Official statements blamed paperwork issues, funding shortages, and zoning approvals. But one anonymous contractor offered a different explanation: there are some parts of that building we're not supposed to touch. Whether that decision came from superstition or fear, no one could say. But the result was undeniable: the hospital remained standing, its secrets still locked inside. And Ward C-21 remained sealed. In the years that followed, urban explorers posted videos of their attempts to reach the East Wing. Most of them turned back long before reaching the corridor. The few who got close described feeling watched, as though the air itself shifted around them. Some reported hearing faint whispers, others described sudden headaches or disorientation. A handful claimed they heard knocking, but none dared approach the door. Footage from these expeditions showed nothing unusual at first glance. But when slowed down, enhanced, or frozen frame by frame, strange anomalies appeared: shadows that didn't belong to anyone, distortions near the door, flickers of movement in the corner of the frame. Something was still there. Something that remembered. The final understanding came slowly to those who studied the hospital's history. The phenomenon inside C-21 was not tied to a single patient, or a single event, or even the quiet mind experiment itself. It was tied to everything the place had endured, every unspoken fear, every suppressed trauma, every mind pushed beyond its limits. It was the sum of everything left behind. A reflection of suffering. A residue of the human psyche. A presence that had never been meant to exist. And yet, it did. The door at the end of the hall stood as a monument to that truth. A silent, immovable barrier holding back something that knew too much, remembered too much, and waited too long in the dark. The investigators agreed on one final point in their closing report: some doors stay shut not to keep us out, but to keep something else in. And some histories remain buried because no one is prepared to face them. Ward C-21 is both. In the end, the story closed just as it began, with a door at the end of a forgotten corridor, and something on the other side listening. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind dies and the world grows still, those who pass near the abandoned hospital swear they hear a familiar sound. A tap. Then another. Then 3 taps, in the same pattern that echoed through the ward decades ago. As if something inside is still waiting. Still aware. Still remembering the people who once tried to forget it.